Welcome to the Grow As We Go podcast. I'm Sam, breathwork coach and self-growth junkie.
And I'm Anthony, your co-host, transformational men's coach, and general question asker.
Here we create space for natural, vulnerable, and deeply connecting conversations on life as it happens, wisdom that I've picked up along the way, and tools to truly enjoy this beautiful life you've been given. I want to appreciate you for being here, whether this is your first time or you've been here since the beginning. We love feedback here, so leave your thoughts and takeaways from this episode in the review section of this podcast. This also helps the podcast become a bit more relevant in search reviews. Another way you can support this podcast is by following me on Instagram at Samantha__Charles and take a screenshot of this episode to share it on your social media and share your takeaways so that your junkie friends can come and get their fix too. Welcome to another episode of Grow As We Go. I'm Sam and we have Anthony here, and today we're going to be diving into Anthony's story.
I am here and I do have a story, so I'm very excited to share those things. Many of you might not know what I've been up to because Sam introduces herself and she's a somatic breathwork coach and she has a lot of really amazing things that are true about her. And the same goes for me, but I'm getting to share some of that today. So long story short, the big three things that I am is a pastor, a transformational men's coach, a school teacher, and a general question asker.
That's four.
Well, counting is not my strong suit. That's why I'm an English teacher and not a math teacher. So, my story. So that might be interesting to hear in contrast to a lot of the things that you are, because it doesn't necessarily seem like that would be something that's like, yes, come to a growth podcast, but here we are, and we'll get a little bit about why that's actually really cool and important to me. So to start off my journey as my development of growth is really around the age that I was 16. I was on AOL Instant Messenger.
Isn't that when we were all
finding new things out about our
16.
bodies. Yeah, of course. So our formative years is when we got all the fun stuff that makes us who we are today, right? All the trauma turned superpowers. Mm-hmm. And then, teenage years are trying to figure out, okay, what am I doing? What am I here for? And I'm starting to become more aware of myself as an actual entity in the world, mm-hmm. instead of just a sort of like attaché to my parents, right?
Right, yeah. Like, oh, I'm actually like a whole human here.
I am a whole human. And the whole human part of me that started
I
was...
can make all these terrible choices.
I don't know what that's like because I didn't make terrible choices. I was the goody two-shoesest of kids. I really was. Like, I never wanted to do anything wrong. And we'll get into why that is in a little bit. But the idea was I was a good church boy. I went to church my whole life. But when I was 3 years old, I was going to church. I was baptized as an infant in the Catholic Church when I was like infinitesimal.
Yeah, well, and I mean, you say that, and it's not like that's an uncommon thing. Like, a lot of kids are raised in the church, and
yeah, but it took. Right?
It for sure took. Yeah, that's what's interesting to me. And I think too, like, I was going to say this earlier, but who you are is really fascinating, and that you're in my life is mm-hmm. fascinating, especially mm-hmm. just from outside perspectives. If mm-hmm. you know me, I was homeschooled. Mm-hmm. My grandpa was an atheist, mm-hmm. I grew up in a different world, and so living in South Texas, of course, I've had my exposure to religion and mm-hmm. Various boyfriends and whatnot and their families as well, and it's always been really interesting. And so I remember when we met and we were talking about how you're a pastor, I had my own judgments in the beginning.
For sure.
And it's really interesting, and I've loved your perspective on things because you're not an average pastor, if you will.
Yeah, that's a really good word to say.
You're also not an average teacher, if you will.
That's
and so
true.
Because you're those two things, or you've had those two professions, I find it really fascinating having conversations with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it offers a different set of backgrounds, because when you're 16 and you're typing on AOL Instant Messenger about like, hey, Jesus really matters to me, to like people who are Mormon, And
you want to know what I was doing when I was 16 in AOL chats?
were you sexting? I don't know.
ASL.
Oh, right.
Age, sex, location, which then led up to like sex chatting. Yes,
Gotcha.
absolutely.
Okay.
At like younger than 16.
Yeah, I didn't know what that was, right? Like I was like, I don't even know how do you do the thing at all. My introduction to that world was literally like I think 2 different statements that are sentences. One is like, if you feel like you're going to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, but it also isn't going to the bathroom, just throw your underpants in the wash afterwards. And I'm like, oh, is this a normal experience for people?
Oh my God.
And then
that was your
wet
wet dream conversation
that
with your
was
parents?
that, yes. Parent one.
Parent.
I will not mention which one. But anyway, so there's that. And then the next thing that happened was in my Bible class is where we got our sexual education.
Oh, God,
and that was
good heavens.
that was if you don't do it.
Because you'll get pregnant and die.
Well, yeah, that's part of it. I mean, I wouldn't get pregnant and die.
True, that's
so, you know, but I would be sitting, right? And then the other part of it was if you're going to do it in a certain location, then you need to wear 2 condoms instead of 1.
Oh.
So I love that realization from your eyes. So that's the extent of my sex conversations by the time I am 18 years old. So, but 2 years ago, at 16, I'm sitting in my room having these conversations about Jesus because it's a big deal to me, and still is. But we'll get into what that looks like.
Fully indoctrinated.
Just completely in it, and literally indoctrinated. And this person goes, "Okay, well, what is it that makes the difference?" I'm typing that. Like, this is what makes the difference. For me, up until that point, the religious community had been a space where I was able to have belonging, and like where I felt like there were people who cared about me and who loved me, and they were my friends there. And so I had not had that like traumatic response or even realization of the things that were not helpful. So I was typing about Jesus has set me free in ways. Like I know that the things that I do wrong are forgiven, and that I get to work on those things. And so like from a young age, I had that growth mindset. But literally as I'm typing this message, I hear a voice out of nowhere. It's like, "You're going to be a pastor." And I was like, what the hell was that? Like I got real, like, there's no way, like, where did that come from? And over time, telling that story and realizing like that was for me, that was the voice of the divine. And that I settled after that, and I realized, yeah, that's absolutely what I'm supposed to do. And to be a pastor means literally to just be a shepherd or a guide. So,
well, what I find interesting about that story is like you're sharing as a young kid about that it has saved you in ways, and just from talking with you, I feel like your understanding of Jesus's teachings and the Bible is vastly different than what I'm used to hearing from most. I could probably say all of the Christians that I've had exposure to and religious folk, where they're, I don't know, just a lot of my experience with religion and religious people has been very like judgmental and like that I'm wrong and just a lot of judgment. And I've always found that really fascinating, because it's like, isn't that not what we're supposed to be doing?
Absolutely. And at 16 years old, that's all I knew. Like that perspective was really all I knew. Like, yes, I knew I needed to grow, but like I also needed to grow by telling everybody else around me how to grow. Like that was my like thing is, oh, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong. Let me tell you how to do it right.
Oh, okay.
And so like I very much had that. So I wasn't the pastor that I am today. What had happened was I was inside of a home and a church where there were lots of things that people just expected were normal. And the normality, I suppose, of all of that was there is a hierarchy. Like there's a power out there that says this is what's right, this is what's wrong, and you have to follow that. And so I very much followed it. I was 100% in it. My dad was the head of my household, and I had to listen to everything that he said, and so I very much did so. there were also ways in which I very much did what he said, because the consequences of that were that I was made to feel like I didn't belong. That there were ways in which I had to take care of my dad's ego or emotions so that I would then be safe. And he was a man who was operating out of this religious construct in a new way. He became religious when he found out that my mom was pregnant with me, which was not planned. So his story, influences mine. And so the way that we ended up relating was very much in that context of, you're in charge, Dad, and in that sense, God. And I'm your subservient, and I do whatever it is that you do. But I didn't have that view towards God. Instead, I viewed God as my father figure instead of my father. Because my earthly dad they use it as your earthly father and your heavenly father. They talk about this language all the time. So I was coming to terms with the fact that my dad was rough.
Yeah.
The way that we were brought up, the way that I was brought up. I need to clarify, because my experience with my dad is very different from my siblings. But I experienced my dad as the kind of person who said that whatever it is that I did had an effect on him. And so I had to be very, very careful. So I followed every single rule. I was almost never late from curfew. There was one time I was late home before curfew, after curfew. Like my curfew was at like 11 or 10 or something like that. And I walked in 5 or 10 minutes late, and I literally closed the door, was looking at it, turned around, and my dad was standing there in his briefs, like with his hands outstretched, like he was going to fight whoever walked in the door. And I was like, turned around and I like gasped, like, oh, Dad, it's me. Like, don't hurt me. Like, that was my first thought, is like, oh, he actually is going to, like, if he doesn't recognize who it is. It was also just really weird. But this is the person that my father is. It's very much, he was at a place where it made sense for him to operate out of a lot of fear. So I'm getting used to like that experience, and that's normal for me. Your dad yelling at you is normal. Your dad disciplining you strongly is normal. He was also in the military, so that added an extra layer.
Yeah.
And my mom was very much like whatever it is that he's doing to you, I want to protect you from that. And she's, in ways, I'm like, hey, Mom, you're a saint for doing that. Thank you for protecting and taking care of me. And there's lots of ways in which I'm like, I'm sorry that you had to do that.
Yeah.
Because you shouldn't have had to. But all of that is taking place inside of this religious construct, where it's like, there's a hierarchy. So I go to college, and the college that I go to is a Christian college, because I'm going to be a pastor. And in that process, I learned an unbelievable amount about myself. Like, the biggest thing that I learned was I have a personality outside of the one that I had at home. And the truth is, I just didn't go home for a long time. I think I went home once for fall break of my freshman year, and then I didn't go home again until the beginning of my sophomore year. And I went for like a week, and then I, again, didn't go back for like another year or 2 years.
Yeah. And
like a lot of people's experience is not like that. And I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that people went home like every weekend.
Right. Or
some of them went home, every once a month. And I was just not. I really, truly left and just never came back.
Yeah.
But I was knee deep, neck deep, eyeball deep in church stuff. So like I had theology professors my first year as a freshman. And I used a lot of that learning about the Bible and that learning about myself by taking like the Myers-Briggs and the Strengths Finder and things like that to learn about who I am as my own individual person, separate from my family.
Right.
And that was a pretty big start into that whole thing. I started learning about relationships.
When you say that whole thing, what do you mean?
That whole thing of like growing as a person.
Okay.
Like that I have my own separation. That like I'm not enmeshed with my family.
Oh, okay.
So when I started to take the time to recognize that and learned, I am a person who's really loves being around people. Love being around people. I was never not around people. Like in college, one of my youth pastor who I was like working under, he was like, I can't ever go to your school cafeteria with you. And I was like, why? He's like, because it takes you 45 minutes to get from the door to the cafeteria. And it's not a big building. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry. I get to say hi to everybody I know. And like, he's like, everyone hugs you. Every girl in there is in love with you. I'm like, no one's in love with me. No one. That's not the case. But I am very friendly and very outgoing. And anyway, that like whole thing, that became my personality.
Yeah.
Right? Like I love to interact, hear their stories and all that stuff.
Was that not there before?
It was. It just wasn't really welcome. Like I knew everybody in my tiny private Christian school, right? Tiny private Christian school, fairly tiny private Christian college, and then I went to seminary later too. So like every institution I've been to has been like soaked in the Jesus, right? But no, I mean I knew everybody, but at the same time I wasn't as outgoing because I couldn't have friends over. It wasn't that I didn't invite people over. It was that people knew that my house was the one that you don't go to because my dad is not helpful in his discussions or communications with kids. And I always wondered why it was that I was the one going over to people's houses or why I was leaving, but I didn't realize that until much later.
Yeah.
And so sophomore year rolls around, and I've been going through this Jesus stuff to learning about the Bible and learning about it in a very different way and learning about how judgmental I was. That it wasn't helpful for me to do that, to tell people you have to believe this, you have to believe this. It was like one of my theology professors said, the Bible isn't a list of rules of do's and don'ts. It is a revelation of who God is and how we respond to that God. Because it's really just a collection of stories.
Yeah.
It's a collection of stories about people that some of them were real historically and some of them were mythologically real historically. Like Adam and Eve, it's incredibly difficult for anyone to argue with me that they actually existed.
Yeah.
Because like, how do you record that?
Right.
You don't. So there's a whole lot there. And we can get into that more later, but this isn't about religion solely, it's about me. So I started to realize there's more to it. There's more to it than just like everything that I was taught while I was growing up. So I expanded my view of religion. And in expanding my view of religion, one of the things that was happening was people would come to me and ask questions. And I was like, okay, cool. I love knowing things. I love that people ask me questions and that I'm able to be like, this is what the Bible says. The Bible says. No. So my mom called me one day. And she said, I need to know what the Bible says about divorce. And I was like, all right, is there any way I could know why this is an important conversation right now? Even though I knew the answer to that question.
Yeah.
And so I said, this is what the Bible says. And the fact of the matter is, if this is what you need to do, then I support you. I'm 100% here for you. And she had said something about how the Bible had communicated to her that this was the right thing to do. And I was like, I think that's God telling you to go for it.
Yeah.
And so that was an interesting journey for me because that set me on a deep depression. That whole experience was like, okay, my foundation, my core, my everything that I was built on fell apart. Because I was built on my mom and dad. Like what they had trained me up to do, who they had trained me up to be, that was all my foundation. And so a lot of that crumbled, and I became very sad because I was like, okay, well, is this what I'm here for? I mean, am I here to like just give my mom a little bit of support in going her own way, and then I'm left to pick up the pieces? And even though it's not what my mom was doing, she needed to do what was best for her in that time.
Yeah.
But my dad was super bitter and angry, and he would call me and just ream me about my mom and how this she was, now that she was, now she's doing everything wrong. And I was like, I get to play a middleman that I'm not ready to play.
Right.
So watching that happen meant that I just got really sad, and I didn't know that I was sad at that point. And that was the first time that they were like, hey, maybe you should try counseling.
Who's they?
My leadership team. So I was on the leadership team in my dorm, all guys, 100 of them. It was a ridiculous amount of testosterone in the building. There were too many naked people. It was just, it was insane. The pent up stuff in that hallway was ridiculous, but it was fun. And my leadership team said, you should consider going to the counseling session. like, and I was like, it's a counseling session. Like, I don't, well, where even can I do that? Because like, I'm a poor college student, you know, I've been working with youth pastors for the last bit, and my paychecks every 2 weeks are like $80. I don't know how that's going to work. But we had a counseling session or counseling center on the campus. So I was able to go, and it was the first time that I recognized that I was really mad at my dad.
Yeah.
And I was really upset at my parents. Why would they do this to me? And so what the counselor basically did was heard me out for a little while. And I realized that I didn't like my story. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't.
Yeah.
And I was coming to terms with that at 19 years old. Oh, actually, I was still 18. And I'm like, I don't want to tell this. It's awful. Like, nothing really happened except my parents got divorced. People have way worse stories than that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was sitting with a bunch of... Who was I sitting with? We would travel around to different church camps and like do drama skits and stuff like that. And like, for some reason, they always made me be Jesus because I had facial hair, I guess. Like, I don't know. And I had like a little bit darker complexion. So I was like, okay, sure. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. I'm Jesus. Oh, of course I am. Oh. And so...
Fed the ego.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. So much. I didn't even know about that yet, right? So there I am at church camp. And everybody in my little team, there were 4 of us, 2 guys and 2 girls. And they were like, all right, the 4 of you, testosterone/estrogen-filled, hormone-filled children, go out into the world and be drama people for the kids at church camp. And I'm like, it's really interesting that you sent us out as 2 boys and 2 girls, because that really could have ended in really interesting ways. And I think it did for a lot of teams, but
yeah,
it was fun. Anyway. The team
but
that we
not
had,
yours, because you're too goody two shoes.
No, I was too goody two shoes. No, I bonded with the guy in my group, and that was the interesting. This is really the first part when I realized that like you can be familially friends with the opposite gender. Like that's the first time, right? At this point, I'm just like
19.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
Because at that point I had dated one person, and we just smooched a lot because it was fun. So that was it. So like I'm here with all these people at college. I didn't have a partner a lot of times, and this communication with these 2 girls and this other guy with me was like, tell me your story. And I was like, I don't want to tell you my story. Like, it's stupid. Like, literally, like, it's dumb. Like, I don't have anything to say. And they would like tell these stories about these wild things that happened to them and like, you know, their family and stuff like that. And I was the last to go. So like the 3 of them shared their stories, which were really powerful. And then I was like, I think I just said it. I said, I hate my story. It's stupid. I'm mad at my dad all the time for probably very little actually good reason. And then the rest of it just came out. I started talking about my family. I started talking about my origin and upbringing. I started talking about the religious stuff. I started talking about them, my mom and my dad, and my brother and my sister. And I was just infuriated, but it was so cathartic.
Yeah.
Like, what a release. And so everything just came out. And they were like, we're here for you. And there was no judgment, and there was no, like, you need to have a different story. It was like, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your story. And that was the first time I realized, like, okay, I forget love stories now. Like, like I've always loved English, and that was my AP class in college, in high school. Like, ooh, I took English. And because I just loved books. I loved reading, and I had read my whole life. And I'd read the Bible for a really long time, too. So, like,
there's a bunch of stories in that, so.
And taking those stories. So then what I learned was taking the story that was my life and taking the story that was the stories in the Bible and putting them together was how I then got to, like, minister and preach. And so I weaved my story into the story of God, which was really helpful. And that was, like, kind of the branches and roots of, like, where all of this now growth came from. So college happens, and after college, I moved out to Ohio because I was seeing someone at the time, and I started being a youth pastor. This was, it was cool. I forgot about this story. Driving by a church on my way to visit my then girlfriend at the time at Ohio University, and I look over at a church. I'm about to graduate from college. Look over at this church, and I hear a voice say, you should go in there. And I was like, well, I'm not going to ignore that voice again because I didn't ignore it before, but like it was cool. I was like, okay, great. So that Sunday I went to church there. After church I was like, hey, do y'all have a youth pastor? Because I was looking for a job. And they were like, yeah, we do. He's in the other room. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know why I came in here. Walk into the room. He's up there playing his guitar, of course, because every youth pastor, you either need to, before you leave college, you either need to get married or learn to play guitar. Like, those are the two options available for you.
You're like, I'm an overachiever, and I did both.
Except I wasn't married at the time.
Oh.
Right? I was just dating someone, so I was like, got away with the one. Didn't have a ring by spreading your money back. That was the... So I say, hey, Matt was his name. Hey, Matt. Nice to meet you. My name's Anthony. I'll talk about youth ministry a little bit. And I said, well, if you know of any youth ministry openings in the area, let me know. And he goes, wait a minute, are you looking for a job? I was like, yeah, why? He's like, well, I'm leaving in 2 months. And I was like, well, I'm graduating in 2 months. So
perfect.
Right? How does that work? Very wheezy laugh there. So it was great. Worked out perfectly. Ended up working in a tiny school outside of Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. It was there that I went to church camp after I'd broken up with my girlfriend at the time, and I met the person who would become my wife. Mm-hmm. And so we dated for like 9 months, or we dated for 3 months, got engaged, and then 6 months later got married. And we had 2 kids together, and so like that whole time was like, wow, like that was me being a youth pastor and like thinking, okay, I'm living my call.
Yeah.
I am living the thing that I am meant to do, because when I say my call, throughout that process of becoming an ordained pastor in the United Methodist Church, you go through this process where you are vetted for a long time. Like you start out as a candidate, and then you become another level, and then you become another level, and then you become ordained. And it took 8 years, an 8-year-long process, which is great because then you don't get weirdos as much.
Yeah.
Right? Like in certain churches where they don't vet people, it's like, hey, I'm your youth pastor. And then you find out in the newspaper later that they were like running like a trafficking ring. Like it's awful. There are real things about that, and it's not fun and not pleasant. Like the reality of the church, and that I recognize, is that everything is not hunky-dory. And it never has been over the 2,000-year history. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And just like with anything, there are people that are involved in these organizations. Right. And the people involved in these organizations aren't always awesome. And I've not always been awesome. Yeah. And I've done hurtful things and harmful things. And I've pushed people away. And I've been judgmental. But never started a sex trafficking ring. So that's a plus for me. Yeah, exactly. So, and that, there's sadness and grief in that, in what could be. But in the midst of that process of growing and learning, you learn about your call. And being able to speak and say, like, I know that I'm called to be a shepherd, a guide. I know that I'm called to do that. And whatever God has for me, whatever that looks like, I'm open to it. But I didn't get to that point until like 4 years into my process. I thought it was like, I'm going to be a youth pastor. I'm going to be a youth pastor. I'm going to be a youth pastor. Like, this is what I'm going to be for the rest of my life. And I was a youth pastor for about 14 years. And in the midst of that process of being a youth pastor and getting ordained, which is 1 year recently, that I suddenly didn't work for the church anymore. Like right after, and I guess kind of in the middle of the COVID times, the period referred to as, they just didn't have the space for a multitude of reasons. And I was like, well, what do I do now? Like, what's next? And also in that 8-year process and also in that journey, yeah, I'd gotten married, I'd had kids, and it came time for me to get a divorce too. Mm-hmm. So I got a divorce, Corona happened, and then and then I lost my job as a pastor. So
triple whammy.
Yeah, just boom, boom, boom. So one year after the other. Yeah, and the year before that too, 2019, I graduated from seminary. So there was like a span of 7 or 8 years that I'm kind of glossing over, but there's a little bit of reason for that. There was not a lot of growth in that time. I personally had supplanted my relationship with my father for the one with my wife.
Well, yeah, and I feel like that's a really common thing that, I mean, probably if you dive into your own story, everybody listening, like that's something that we do. I feel like relationships are a huge opportunity for healing our wounds wounds as children. And oftentimes, I mean, they say it all the time, like you marry your mom or you marry your dad. And I know that I did that for a really long time, you know, just kind of growing through my parents, basically, is what I did in relationship.
Yeah, and that was what I was trying to do was I was trying to be codependent for my whole marriage, where I was like, hey, will you fix the wounds? Yeah, of course not on purpose. Yeah.
Right.
Like, will you fix
hey,
the
I'm
wounds?
going to come into this relationship and be totally codependent. It's going to be awesome.
It's going to be great. Plus, I totally knew what the word codependent even meant at that point.
Right.
So I was like, fix me. I'm broken. And if I do all of these things, then you're going to fix me too. Like, it's just not helpful.
Yeah. I'd love to have another episode about that.
Yeah, we can absolutely go into that. Another episode about codependency, because it happens way faster than you think. All of a sudden you're like, oh, that was a really codependent action of me. And there's a difference between doing the behaviors and like creating a pattern.
Right.
And I created a really long pattern. And I put all these unnecessary expectations on her. And that was not helpful for our marriage. And so it fell apart, and I take responsibility for how I was completely making her do things or take responsibility for things that she couldn't. Simply no human being could. I was the only person that could fix that, and I just left it at her feet, and that's not fair. And so in the midst of that experience, I started to realize this. I wanted to have a good relationship because I've always loved relationships in general. I always loved giving relationship advice, and clearly it worked out really well in my favor. This was in the middle of COVID though, right? So dating during COVID was so much fun. It was great. I mean, I had a good time because I had fun with everything, but also it was unique. Like, I started to figure out, like, okay, I get to do something to become different. The first thing that I said to become different was, I would like to lose some weight, because at that point I was 265 pounds. And I was just, as I took pictures of myself, I was like, ew, I don't like this. And then I realized later that what that was all wrapped up in. But I thought to myself, okay, I can start taking care of myself.
Yeah.
So what does taking care of myself look like? Okay, well, I get to go to the gym, and I'm going to start seeing a counselor. So just before my relationship with my wife ended, I did start seeing a counselor. And we started talking about the things that I was doing that was getting in the way. And there was a lot. There was no shortage of things that got in the way, especially my codependency. She gave me a book called The New Codependency by Melody Beattie. And I began to recognize how I was using someone else to fix my own crap.
Right.
And you said we do. Right.
Unconsciously.
So started talking with my therapist or counselor about that. Like, what is that? What is that all about? And every time that we talked, it was basically, you get to spend time healing now. You get to spend time healing the wounds that you have accrued over your life. And it gets to look however it's going to look, but talk to me once a week and then also read. And I read so many books. I mean, it's unbelievable. Just consumed them like I would consume a cheese pizza. Like, it was ridiculous. I was a youth pastor for 15 years, so I could eat a cheese pizza with the best of them. But I couldn't stop reading. I read everything that I could possibly get my hands on about relationships, about healing, about the healing journey, about the process. Oh my gosh, I was in it like to my neck. So, I mean,
this is during like 2020 COVID times?
2019 into 2020 COVID times. Okay. Yeah. And
even on it's beyond. Really interesting because I feel like, I know COVID did a lot of that for a lot of people. Like, it gave people an opportunity to heal. And so that's one of the huge like upsides that I see to that whole era.
Yeah.
And I've also talked to a few people around like that actually happening a bit before COVID. Mm-hmm. Like it started the ball rolling. Yeah. And I find that, I don't know, I just personally find that really fascinating from like a energetic, like ethereal world, like
well, you can take
the evolution of humans.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And that whole conversation.
Yeah, you can take every experience in history like that. Like, it's going to be a huge historical moment forever, but that's not what we're talking about. But still, it is still part of my story. But the part of my story that is significant there is, I had my kids, right, for half the time. And we were trying to do school as best we could. They sent home a Chromebook and sheets and stuff like that. And we were like, okay, we're going to try and be school teachers on top of being whatever. And I didn't really work for a few months. I was still doing youth ministry once a week on Zoom and stuff like that. We were still going into church. After a few months, we would go in and be really socially distanced, and it'd only be like 4 or 5 people there and all that stuff like that. But we still preached sermons and sent that out to people. So
I thought you got fired.
that was right after the COVID times. So
okay. You weren't fired yet.
Seminary divorce 2019, COVID 2020, fired 2021. So there's my 3-year span of fun. And in that 3 years, I'm reading all the time. I'm reading Attached, and I'm reading about attachment styles, reading about relationships, reading about healing, reading about people, reading about personalities, reading about high conflict personalities, reading about communication, reading about everything that I could get my hands on when it came to like relating to people. And go ahead.
So this is interesting because I know you more than
than
what we do on this podcast, right? So what I'm hearing whenever I hear you like obsessively learning is like to be the best.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like from my childhood on until now, the reality is that like I had to know lots of information because that's what kept me safe.
Right.
So it was, in order to be, I needed to be the best because my dad told me you need to be the best at everything. You could be the president of the United States. And there was a little bit in there where I was like, I think that what you mean is that I need to be the president of the United States in order for you to be proud of me. Right? Like, I need to rise to this level. And that was something that actually now, looking back at that relationship, my dad had really high expectations for me because he knew what I was capable of. But he also wanted me to do those things so that he would look good. So, but if I take that part, that's like, my dad saw something in me. He saw that I was really, really smart, and he celebrated that always. He celebrated my intelligence. He celebrated my abilities. But the reason that he did that is because it made him look cool.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to let him down.
Right.
So when I was really, really smart because I had to be. And that's how I was safe, and that's how I proved my worth. And even up until now, right? Like up until a certain point.
That's a recent discovery of yours.
It is. Oh, yeah, absolutely it is. I didn't know that. Yes, thanks to you. Thank you for opening my eyes to that, Sam. You're so wise. I know.
Wait, opening your eyes to what?
You're so wise. Oh, opening that my pursuit of knowledge was not just about like wanting to know a lot. It was also about my self-worth.
Yeah.
Like I was worthy if I knew a lot. Yeah. So
that's a conversation for another time.
It is. We'll get there. Yeah. But in the midst of that growth journey, really the growth that was happening there was that I was just inundated with information about people and myself. And the big thing that was a huge growth area was learning how to set boundaries. So boundaries, what I learned boundaries are the limits of love. Mm-hmm. They are the extent to which you can be in relationship with another person and still continue that relationship with them in a loving way. Yeah. And that loving way did not mean that I had to fix their problems or be in significant, close, constant relationship with them. And that was a really big shift for me.
Yeah.
Is I was like, oh, I can like let this person go. And that does not mean that I don't love them.
Right. And I think that gets to be another conversation here because I learned a lot about boundaries from you as well. Mm-hmm. And that opened up a lot of things in my life and learnings in my life around boundaries like that. And my ALA process, I feel like there was a lot that came up around that, like my severe lack of boundaries. And like people pleasing and all this stuff. And I feel like it's almost, what do they call that? Like an infection where
it just spread throughout you?
No, not for me. Like a pandemic or something of there being, epidemic is what the word I was looking for. Like an epidemic of boundaryless people in the world.
Right. Yeah, because...
Or at least in America and the culture.
Sure. That there's a lot of people who just, okay, we go along to get along.
Right.
Right. And there's, it was work the board place.
Right. Yeah. And this is another conversation we had the other day where it's like people don't know how to have conversations when there's disagreement. Exactly.
Which, huge, because that's that conflict conversation and how that works plays huge into a lot of my learning too. But
well, in the conflict conversation, it's like you either go one way or the other, where you just acquiesce and go along to get along, like you said, don't rock the boat. I'm not going to speak up for myself and put in place boundaries, basically, because then it might negatively affect the relationship, or there might be consequences or whatever, or the other person's going to fucking explode.
Yeah.
And so there's that side of reacting, and then the other side is the reactive side, where it's you just get fucking angry and you can't deal with it and you can't process having a difficult conversation, so you walk out the room.
Right, exactly. And emotions are a thing, and then you're allowed to have those and all that stuff like that. And you're absolutely right.
And there's a way to have effective communication around things that are challenging, and that's what I like. Absolutely. I love having those conversations because it takes a lot of emotional intelligence and emotional and awareness within yourself to be able to have conversations like that where you can agree to disagree.
Yeah, and then you're crying in a sushi restaurant.
Yep. Personal story.
But and I mean, you and I are gonna have a mock conversation like that at some point too, what it looks like to have healthy conflict, because I dove into it. I was basically like, look, anything that could be present in a healthy relationship, I want to have that. I want to have those things, and because I don't ever want to go through an unhealthy relationship again.
Yeah, and I love that you said it like that, because whenever you're in relationship, there will be conflict.
Always, yeah.
That's a part of living together or being in relationship, is that you're going to have disagreements, and what better way to stay in a relationship than to learn how to deal with those, and to have the languaging and the learning and the know-how to have those difficult conversations.
Yeah, exactly. Because when I was...
What a skill to have.
Oh, it's the best skill to have. It's so helpful. Someone jokingly called me the king of conflict the other day, and I was like, I don't know if that's okay, you're good at conflict, or if you're man, you always want to fight people.
Probably not.
I know
Probably
it's not.
First.
I know it's not the second one, but it sounds, off the ear, that it's like that. But what it really is I learned what it's like to have disagreements with people in a loving way, to be able to speak from my side of the fence and know that the other person isn't going to take it personally. But people take things personally. So I had a relationship after I was married. I had a relationship last for about a year, and then that ended, and I learned a lot from that relationship as well. Just especially for me, that the setting of boundaries, which is okay, yes, you're allowed to set your boundaries. We can continue having a relationship, and that might mean that relationship's not for me anymore.
Right.
Right. And so, whatever that looks like over time, and with thoughtful consideration and careful conversation, you get to decide those things and not say, okay, well, boundaries mean that this person is going to get what they want and I'm going to get what I want and everyone's going to be happy. That's not what boundaries are. Boundaries aren't about who's happy. It's about, I say that this is what I'm able to do. And if that's not a thing that jives with you, then it's not like we can't have a relationship. But at the same time, I'm going to choose to care for myself and care for this relationship in a way that means that some things have to end.
Yeah. So this reminds me of something, and this is going to go somewhere that I don't know if people believe in all this stuff, but here we go. So, aliens.
Fun. Wow. What a coming out of left field. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I know. But there's a point to it. So it's I've gone to a lot of meditation stuff, and there's, if you know Joe Dispenza or Stephen Greer, he's I call him the alien guy, but he's done a lot of really interesting documentaries, and he hosts meditations one of them's called Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, and that's really fascinating. I would recommend.
Okay.
And so with that, they talk about these different entities, aliens or whatever, whatever the terminology you want to use, but different entities coming here to help. And them only lowering their, because like the idea is that aliens are like not what you see in the news, right?
Okay,
like they're highly evolved, highly loving, and like just so conscious and have all these amazing capabilities, and I get all excited. And it's like that they are love.
Okay.
And like the highest, which is the highest form of, like the highest frequency is love.
Yes, absolutely.
And so they are love. And that's why they have all these healing capabilities and like magic. And, whether you believe this or not, like it's a cool story, right?
Yeah.
So we'll just go with it. And
and there's a point to it. Yeah.
There's a point to it. It's like that we as humans are not at love all the time.
Right.
We go through all these different emotions, and some of the lower ones are like hate and anger and whatnot. And that's very prevalent in this world. And so aliens don't come here very much because they will not lower themselves to that, because it's detriment of themselves.
Right.
So that's what comes to me whenever I hear you talking about like boundaries and limits of love.
Right.
And not lowering your standards, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
To what you're willing to accept in your world.
Right. Because you are allowed to say that.
To stay in relationship, right? So we don't have a relationship with aliens because
they can't. Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. I see where you're going now, and yes, absolutely makes sense. And to a certain, yes, I see myself. I can see how that story. I am the alien, and there are ways in which I'm saying my love does not mesh with this. Right. So perfect. What a great example. That's so fun, too. I'm so excited to have that podcast episode.
Oh my God, I love it.
It's fun. So I aligned myself with love over the course of that 3-year healing journey. So it took time for me to realize that, like, okay, why am I really reading all of this stuff? Why am I trying to do this? And I'd been in a relationship, and then I got into another relationship, which was very clearly me trying to be like, hey, I can save you. Not helpful. And surprise, surprise, I couldn't. And I very much realized, God, I can't ever do that again. And I take a lot of stuff onto myself that's completely unnecessary. And so I set a boundary with myself. I said, self, I'm not going to take my relationships so dang seriously. Like, I got into the point where I was like, okay, I know how to set good boundaries now. Clearly, this was a really important lesson for me, and especially around communicating and relating to people. I don't have to make it so goal-oriented. And the goal-oriented before was like, look, if I was going to be intimate with someone, if I was going to have an intimate relationship with someone, they had to be my partner. They had to be in a relationship with me.
Oh, this is your Jesus stuff.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So very much like I was...
And I feel like you're skirting around the words. Basically, if you were going to have sex with anybody, you needed to be in a committed relationship with them.
Well, even intimacy in general. Like the idea of...
If you were going to kiss somebody.
Well, no. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, I've only kissed a handful of people, but the idea was basically that. Yeah, basically that. We'll just say that for the sake of easiness. Thank you. You're right. Good job. You were the whole time. Thank you. If I wanted to sleep with people, I needed to be in a relationship with them, and at a certain point, it was I needed to be married to them, and so like, and then there's a lot of stuff around religious upbringing that's in there. So I would read about relationships, and a lot of them were from Christian perspectives. And some of them were not. And all of it was remarkably helpful for getting me to the place that I ended up being. Through my healing journey, I got to the place where I realized I am allowed to communicate with other people, find out what their desires are, what their wants are, and if we're aligned, then we get to be adults about that conversation. Mm-hmm. So, if you want to have fun and have fun sleeping together, I'm here for it. And that's okay with me. Like, I'd gotten to that place. And there were a lot of people who were like, don't do that. Like, in my circles, it's still very religious. I had left the church at this point. I'm sorry. I need to be clear. I had not worked in the church. I still am a pastor. And so it's like, wait a minute, you're a pastor and you wanted to, like, have a hoe summer? Like, is that what happened here?
A hoe summer?
Hot Pastor Summer.
Passion.
Yeah. I'll dive into it. Yeah, right. Like I was not saying this is a boundary for me anymore because it had been so harmful around sex and sexuality. And I went to a seminary in 2019 and graduated from that seminary. That sex and sexuality were a really big part of the conversation. I was the minority as a straight white male. Most people that were there were people of color and people in the LGBTQ community. And so I learned a lot about God and a lot about faith from people who didn't take all that stuff so dang seriously.
Yeah.
And it was super, super helpful because what it made me realize was that I get to write my own sexual ethic, right? So I got to write my own, like, this is what's okay for me to do. And this is what's not okay for me to do based on my understanding of faith. And when it comes down to it, love your neighbor as yourself and love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength are really what guide my everything. And because again, love is that alignment. If I'm loving God with all I've got, if I'm loving the divine with all I've got, if I'm loving in a loving energy and I show that to the people around me, I'm not going wrong.
Right.
And so I can communicate with people and I can say, hey, this is what I'm interested in. I'm just learning to relate to people. I'm learning to...
I'm in my hoe phase.
I'm in my hoe phase. I'm not looking for anything serious. Do you want to get together and have some fun? Or like just making it very clear from the beginning.
Right.
And that was my dating experience then. It was like, okay, well, I can see people for a little bit and I guess we're not in alignment and that's okay. And then I can see people for a little bit and we can sleep together a little bit. And then, it turns out we're not in alignment and that's okay. So instead of it being like, oh gosh, I have to try and get this person to get to say yes to be my girlfriend before I can get into bed with them. Like it was like, okay, what happens, and I'm accepting of what happens. And I was at a place where my emotional intelligence was high enough where I could say no when I needed to say no and say yes when it was okay for me to say yes. And so there were times that I ended up telling people, I can't do this anymore. And it wasn't because I was saying, you did anything or this is just incompatible. It was just like, I don't feel like this relationship is going somewhere. And we had conversations about this. So it was setting a boundary. And sometimes people, very, very, very rarely, people weren't happy. But most of the time people were like, yeah, totally, I understand.
Yeah.
And so it was just making my expectations, my desires, my wants not to be too much. Yeah. Because for my whole life, that's what they were. Everything that I did was too much. And so I just started to realize, okay, it doesn't have to be like that. And so I kept reading and understanding more, and I started teaching in school too. So I am a school teacher at the same time that I'm still, going out on dates and things like that. And so students would talk about this, that, and the other thing, and about how much they knew, and I just kind of smile a little bit behind my desk, and go, y'all don't even know. You have so much left growth to do. And there was a bit of something in me that I still hadn't realized, and what I still hadn't realized was that I love teaching, I love coaching, I love walking alongside people in their journeys, and it's a strength that I have, it's a gift that I have. And the reason that I have that gift and the reason that I have that strength is because over all of the years of being the person that I was, when I was able to teach and coach and train people, I was able to show them how valuable I was. And that was not super healthy. So it became a superpower when I realized, I get to do all those things and it gets to be like a win-win situation where it's not just me telling people, hey, this is what you should do to make your life better, even though they didn't friggin' ask. Right. It became something totally different. It became I am open to what we have, however that relationship, if it doesn't have to go somewhere, whatever that relationship looks like in this moment. And it became much more of I'm present to the moment. And so I started learning more about presence and awareness, because up until that point, it was really more about what does my head know? What do I know way up here? And sure, I could connect to people. I'm very empathetic. I understand people's emotions, I understand people's energies. And a lot of that is even because back when I was a kid, I had to sense people's energies. Otherwise, I was going to get in trouble. Mm-hmm. So through my healing journey now, what I realized is all of these things, and this is the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway I think from my whole story, is whatever it is that you had gone through when you were younger and on up until this point, you get to make the decision whether you're going to engage with the parts of you that are deeply hurt. And you get to take out of that the things that you're amazing at because of those experiences. So out of the hurt comes empathy. Mm-hmm. Out of the hurt comes listening. Out of the hurt comes peace. Out of the hurt comes the desire to bring people together in unity. Or you can blame your hurt and you can make those things happen so that you're never hurt again, which isn't really helpful because we're going to get hurt again. Like that's the reality of the world, is that hurtful experiences happen. So that lesson came out of reading The Body Keeps the Score. So I was reading The Body Keeps the Score and doing a journal along with it at the same time. Oh, and I journal, oh my gosh, religiously. I have journaled for years. I've filled up like 2 whole journals already of like a couple hundred pages each over the course of the last 3-4 years. And some people journal even more than that, but I love journaling. Definitely one of the big takeaways from that too is journal, just write stuff down, write your feelings, write your thoughts, write it all. And that's a huge part of my story too. Because of that journaling experience with The Body Keeps the Score, what I realized was I was healing the inner parts of me. I was talking to my little boy and saying, hey, it's okay for you to come out. And I know you were doing the best that you could with the tools that you had, and giving compassion and grace that I have shown to everybody my whole life, to myself. And so that led up to now. And all of that 34 years of journey and learning and experience, I have multiplied by 10 in simply the last year. Suddenly, with, a specific introduction, I was going to have the most transformative year of my entire life.
All right. So before we get there and, potentially start a new podcast on that story, from all that you shared in your story so far, what was your biggest challenge? So
of all of those things, the biggest challenge was I'm trying to heal the relationship with my father. And that big challenge was, I tried to do that through my marriage. Mm-hmm. And clearly that didn't work out that well because our marriage fell apart. Mm-hmm. So, it was hard. It was really hard. Healing from my dad's stuff and my marriage was tough. I didn't know how to overcome it in the moment. Otherwise, I would have figured it out, but I didn't.
So how did you overcome it?
Nice. So, I did eventually because I fell into the hardest time of my life. I thought it was hard, trying to heal that relationship and trying to be in that marriage. And then also I got out of it. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know what my life is going to be.
Right.
And at that point, I was like,
who am I?
Yeah.
Identifying yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. And at that point, I couldn't even try and heal the relationship with my father because he had passed away. Mm-hmm. So real difficult to try and restore that relationship.
Yeah, well, and there's something to be said too, and I know that you've probably gone through a lot of this. You can heal relationships with people who aren't there anymore, whether they're choosing to not be there and they're still alive, like my story, or they're no longer on this planet.
Right. And I will say that's how I overcame a lot of the stuff. Is one day I was writing in my journal not a letter to my dad. I was writing in my journal and I imagined my dad if he were alive and healed today.
Yeah.
And I wrote what he would say to me, and he told me that he was sorry, and he told me that he was doing the best he could, and I cried, wept, just sobbed tears down my face for a good 20 minutes. And it was a huge release, and that was a big overcome, is realizing that I can set myself up and allow other people into my life because I know how to work through some of this hurt now. And it was a beautiful conversation with him. And I've had a few more of those kinds since, and they've been really healing. So,
what was your takeaway?
My story matters. And everyone's story matters. There was no reason for me to not tell the story. So, I go ahead.
I'm curious that's an interesting takeaway. How did you get that?
Well, there were so many times that I was like, I just need to be quiet. I need to not tell people about what's going on in my life. I need to be like keeping everything down. And so I'll only tell certain stories in certain avenues in certain ways. But then really the ultimate thing that came is y'all got to talk about your story when it happens. And y'all got to find the kinds of people who you can share your story with, because you need that in your life. You need people with whom you can say, this crap sucks right now. And I want someone to be there to hold space for it. And so tell your story, share your story, be loud and be vocal, and don't necessarily trauma dump all over everybody, but like find the people, the friends for whom you can share your story and they don't accept your bullcrap. Right? They don't just be like, okay, thanks for telling me that story and that's it. It's like, yeah, I appreciate you telling that story, and what do you get to do moving forward?
Right.
Because if I had had someone early on in my relationship with my dad, if I'd had someone early on in my relationship with my wife and said, hey dude, what's going on there? And really probed into my story, then it would have saved a lot of hurt and healing. And I'm super grateful for every experience that I had, because it made me the person that I am today. Yeah. But yeah, so tell your story.
All right.
And as a story weaver, obviously,
that
makes me real happy.
How ironic that that's your takeaway.
Yeah, I know.
How has telling your story affected you now?
Right. So the biggest thing about telling your story now is that I've learned how to see the patterns in my own story and in other people's stories. So I can see where getting all that knowledge, getting all that information, and healing as that was, the most healing thing was, I don't have to learn a bunch of stuff in order to be worthwhile. I don't have to prove to my dad that I'm worthy. When I tell stories, I get to listen to why I'm telling those stories in the first place. And so it affects me now in a way of saying, I can see when I'm starting to get off kilter, because I'm paying attention to how I'm talking to people, and I'm paying attention to what's going on inside of me. But I didn't learn that until later. So that big part of my story for 34 years, and I'm 35 now, and the last year gets to be a totally different narrative. But the biggest thing that I learned at that point was just share it. Share it and don't keep it bottled in, because the more that you keep it bottled in, the less that other people can offer their perspective. And when the people do offer their perspective, listen. But I didn't get that. Other people offering their perspective is different from other people offering their feedback. So we'll get there. But when I have shared my story recently, I have become a more healed version of myself, because I begin to see the patterns that emerged over and over again, and I get to heal those patterns.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about stories and patterns and in our life and the way that things all play out. I think I love the work that you do with your story weaving, and I think it's really impactful and healing to point those things out to people who are open to hearing them. Yeah. And I know it's been helpful for me and all of your clients who you support.
That's true.
But yeah, there is a lot of unconscious patterns that we have in our life.
I'm so excited for that episode too. And it's just gonna go for a whole one of those multiple times probably.
Yeah, and I know that we had touched on that a little bit in the episode where I was sharing my story. Yeah. And part of what I want to do with some of this podcast, where we can just share about that here really quickly, is have interviews with people and have them share their story and hear it and potentially bring out some story weaving and and allow people an opportunity to see the patterns and to, because they're all unconscious and we're doing them to heal. That's what I believe is we're finding ourselves in these situations and with these people who trigger us or whatever. And I don't know if you've ever found yourself like, why am I always here? Why am I here again? Why is this happening again? And it's all very unconscious and happening, you know, in the energetic world that I spoke of earlier.
Yeah.
Where our bodies are trying to heal, and there's a lot moving forward and in cahoots for that to happen, basically. And so I love that, and I'm super excited about having the opportunity to explore that with other people. And the patterns. That was the thing too that I was going to share, was like that in the episode of my story where I was sharing about the story branding course that I did. And that being really interesting to like actually take a look at my story and dive into my story. And so I'd love to have the opportunity to share that with others and have them, you know, potentially have like some really like, whoa, I didn't even realize that. And I'm excited.
Moments I've experienced with you, and you're like, oh my God. And like, that's what I had with myself a lot, was those oh my gosh moments for the things that I began to see patterns in. And the wonderful thing about my growth at this point is I'm in a stage of my life where my growth is stuff that I go out and seek now. Like, I'm like, please tell me how I can grow, or show me how I can grow, because a lot of the things are unconscious now.
Right.
And so I invite people into bringing up the unconscious stuff. The conscious patterns of growth, I get to see those things, and now I love being able to be at that space, and it's really been a long journey to get there. But there are ways in which all of us are going to continue to grow.
Yeah.
You know, we grow as we go. That's why
grow as we go.
Right? It all comes full circle.
On that note, here we grow.
Perfect.
I love the word puns, and so punny.
I'm obsessed with them.
I
So
know. A little too much, but no.
Thank you, host Sam.
You're welcome
for letting me share my story today.
Allowing the space, and I'm glad that you're able to share. And
we'll get into the next.
That was the thing too. Oh gosh, here's another one, right? That the idea of stories, what I got out of it, and I know that you got all excited when I finally came to this concept, that like stories are forever. Like if you think about stories that have been told for years and millennia.
Yeah, around campfires.
Right. There's a lot of old stories that like, and you think about fables and all these different things. And so the idea is that with the story, there is always a lesson.
Yes.
And that goes for you and your healing journey that you just shared with us. And so, that's what I'm looking forward to, is like pulling out the hero's journey and the lessons learned from just, you know, people in our lives and everyday people. So.
Yeah, because you are an abundance of wisdom. When you look at your story and you find out the things that you've learned from it, you get to share those things from a really authentic place. And we need people sharing their stories in this world.
Yeah. If you found parts of this podcast interesting, useful, or at the very least entertaining, I hope that you'll share your takeaways and tag me on social media, or leave a review. And we appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.